You think you understand time because you live inside it. You wake up, the day passes, you go to sleep. Yesterday feels fixed. Tomorrow feels undecided. The present feels like a thin knife edge slicing between what has happened and what hasn't. That picture feels so obvious that questioning it sounds almost insulting. That's why it works. Because nearly everything you've been taught about time is built on that picture, and nearly all of it is wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being slightly inaccurate. Wrong in the sense that it smuggles assumptions into your thinking that physics does not make and cannot support. You were taught to think of time as something that flows, something that moves, something that carries events along. Physics does not describe anything like that. Let's start with the most basic mistake, the one that poisons everything else, the idea that time passes. Ask yourself a simple question. Passes relative to what? When a car passes you on the road, you can point to the thing it passed. When water flows, you can point to the riverbank. When time passes, what is standing still while it moves? There is no answer. The phrase feels meaningful only because you've used it your entire life without inspecting it. Physics does not use that phrase. Physics talks about clocks. A clock is not time. A clock is a physical system that undergoes regular change. A pendulum swings. A quartz crystal vibrates. An atom oscillates. You count those changes, and you call the count time. Nothing flows. Nothing moves. You are just labeling change. This sounds trivial until you notice what physics does next. It compares clocks, and that's where your intuition collapses. Two identical clocks placed in different situations do not agree. One moved faster, one sat in stronger gravity, one ends up recording less time than the other. Not because it malfunctioned, because time itself behaves differently along different paths through spacetime. This is not philosophical. It is measured, it is corrected for. GPS systems fail without it. Particles decay differently without it. The universe enforces it whether you like it or not. This alone should make you suspicious of the idea that time is some universal substance flowing uniformly everywhere. If time were like that, clocks would not disagree. They would simply read it off. They don't. Now comes the mistake that really matters. The belief in a universal present. You think there is a single now shared by the entire universe. A moment that everyone, everywhere agrees on. It feels so natural that you probably never questioned it. Relativity kills it instantly. Two observers moving relative to each other do not agree on what events are happening right now. What you call present, another observer can legitimately call past or future. Both descriptions are correct. The laws of physics allow both. There is no privileged observer. No master clock. This is not a technical loophole. It is the core of the theory, which means the present is not a feature of the universe. It is a feature of your perspective. Once that's gone, the rest of what you were taught about time has nothing solid left to stand on. The idea that the past exists but the future doesn't relies entirely on the idea of a universal now. Without that, the distinction collapses. Physics never says the future is unreal. That was something you added because it matched how memory works. Memory points backward. Entropy increases. Information spreads. Those facts explain why you remember yesterday and not tomorrow. They do not explain why tomorrow does not exist. You confused what you can access with what is real. This is the same mistake people made when they thought the Earth felt stationary, so it must be. Or when they thought matter felt solid, so it must be. Feeling is not evidence of structure. In physics, time is a coordinate. Just like space, events have locations in space and locations in time. The equations do not single out one slice and label it special. They describe relationships across the whole structure. That structure is space-time. Space-time is not a stage where things happen one after another. It is the thing that contains all events. Past, present, future are not being created in sequence. They coexist as parts of the geometry. This is where people start to panic, because they hear this and think it means nothing matters, or that free will is an illusion, or that life is predetermined. That panic comes from importing the wrong metaphor. You imagine space-time as a finished movie, already filmed, already decided. That image is wrong. Space-time is not a script. It is a record. It includes your thoughts, your indecision, your hesitation, your mistakes. It does not skip the process. It contains it. From inside that structure, you experience uncertainty because you do not have access to future information. From outside the structure, uncertainty is not a property of existence. It is a property of knowledge. This distinction is everything, and it's the one you were never taught. You were taught that time flows, that the present is special, that the future is open, and that physics somehow justifies all of this. It doesn't. Physics quietly dismantles it, and then waits for you to catch up. Once you do, a lot of familiar questions dissolve. You stop asking when the future becomes real. You stop asking where the present is located. You stop asking why time only goes one way. Those questions were built on a picture that never matched reality. Time doesn't flow. The present isn't universal. The future isn't unreal. What exists is a space-time structure with internal correlations, and you are embedded in it. The shock is not that physics says this. The shock is how long you were able to believe otherwise, without noticing the cracks. Once you let go of the idea that time flows, the next belief collapses almost automatically. The belief that the universe is constantly becoming something new, that reality is under construction, that events come into existence as time advances. Physics does not describe anything like that. When physicists write down the laws governing motion, fields, or space-time itself, they do not describe a universe that is assembling frame by frame. They describe relationships between events across the entire structure. The equations do not wait for the present to arrive. They relate what happens at one time to what happens at another, without privileging either. This is deeply counterintuitive because your experience is sequential. You encounter moments one after another. But that sequence is not a property of the universe. It is a property of how information reaches you. You never experience space-time as a whole. You experience a slice. And that slice updates because signals take time to reach you, and because your brain can only process information in a particular order. That limitation feels like time moving. It isn't. To see how misleading this is, imagine a very simple universe with only two events. One happens on Earth. One happens on Mars. Depending on how fast you're moving, you can legitimately say the Earth event happened first, or the Mars event happened first, or that they were simultaneous. The universe does not correct you. It does not insist on a single order. Now ask yourself what it would mean to say that one of those events had not happened yet. From whose perspective? There is no universal answer. And if there is no universal answer, the idea that reality itself is being created in sequence makes no sense. This is why physicists say that time is a dimension, not a process. You don't say that space comes into existence 1 meter at a time. You don't say the left side of the room is real, but the right side isn't yet. You understand that space is there all at once. Even though you can only see part of it, time works the same way. You only ever experience a thin slice because you are embedded in it. That slice changes because you move through space-time, not because space-time is moving. This is the single hardest idea to accept because it requires you to flip the relationship you've always assumed. You thought time carries you. Physics says you carry your clock. Once you internalize that, the so-called arrow of time starts to look very different. You were taught that time has a direction, that it flows from past to future, and that this flow is fundamental. Physics does not say that. The fundamental laws of physics work almost perfectly the same forward and backward in time. If you reverse the equations, they still make sense. They do not break. They do not point at one direction and say, this is the right way. So where does the arrow come from? Not from time itself. From entropy. Entropy is not a force. It does not push time forward. It is a measure of how many microscopic arrangements correspond to the same macroscopic situation. There are many more disordered arrangements than ordered ones. Systems naturally drift toward disorder because there are simply more ways to be disordered. That statistical fact explains why you remember the past and not the future. It explains why eggs break and don't unbreak. It explains why information spreads. It does not define what exists. You mistake the arrow of memory for the arrow of reality. This is why time feels one-directional to you. Your brain records information in one direction because that's how entropy behaves in the environment you evolved in. If entropy behaved differently, your experience of time would too. The universe does not promise you a direction. It gives you a structure. Your experience of direction emerges from how you are embedded in it. This is where the idea of fate often sneaks in, and it sneaks in incorrectly. People hear that the future exists and assume it means everything is fixed, predetermined, inevitable, that nothing can change. But this is a confusion between structure and constraint. The future existing does not mean it exists independently of what you do. It exists including what you do. Your choices are not overwritten by the future. They are part of it. From inside your experience, choices feel open because you do not know what you will choose. That ignorance is real. It guides behavior. It matters. But ignorance is not absence. From the perspective of the space-time structure, your deliberation is an event like any other. It has a location. It has consequences. It shapes what follows. Nothing is lost. Nothing is bypassed. The discomfort comes from expecting the universe to validate your feeling of openness by keeping the future unreal. Physics does not do that. It explains why the feeling exists instead. Once you stop asking physics to protect your intuitions, a lot of apparent mysteries disappear. You stop asking why the future feels open if it already exists. You recognize that feeling as a feature of limited information. You stop asking why time flows. You realize nothing ever needed to. This is the real truth you were never taught. Time was never the thing you thought it was. Not a river, not a conveyor belt, not a force pushing events along. It was always a dimension. And dimensions do not move. Once you truly absorb that, time is a dimension and not a process. A strange thing happens. Many questions you thought were profound simply evaporate. They were never about reality. They were about the pictures you were using. Take the question, when does the future become real? It sounds deep, until you realize it assumes the future isn't real yet. That assumption does not come from physics. It comes from how memory works. You don't remember the future, so it feels unreal. Physics does not confuse access with existence. Or take, why can't we go back in time? That question assumes time is a one-way track with a built-in direction. Physics never says that. It asks instead, what paths through spacetime are allowed? The restriction is geometric, not moral. You were taught to think of time as something that happens to the universe. Physics tells you time is part of the universe. This reversal is subtle, but absolute. Now think about how often language quietly lies to you. You say time moves faster when you're busy. You say it drags when you're bored. You say you're running out of time. None of this corresponds to anything physical. Time does not speed up. It does not slow down. You do. Your perception changes because your brain compresses or expands memory formation. When more happens, time feels longer in retrospect and shorter in the moment. When less happens, it feels the opposite. This is neuroscience, not cosmology. But because you were never taught to separate these layers, you were handed metaphors instead of mechanisms. And metaphors, once internalized, become invisible assumptions. Physics doesn't use those metaphors. It uses clocks. And clocks do something very specific. They measure proper time along a path. That's it. Once you understand this, another illusion dissolves. The idea that time is the same everywhere. It isn't. Time depends on where you are and how you move. Two people can experience different amounts of time between the same events. And neither experience is privileged. This alone should destroy the idea that time is a universal backdrop. If time were a backdrop, it would not depend on motion or gravity. It would simply be there. It isn't. Now let's return to the idea of cause and effect, because this is where people try to salvage a one-way flow. They say, fine, maybe time doesn't flow, but causes still come before effects. That must be fundamental. Even that is shakier than you were taught. In relativity, what counts as before and after can depend on the observer. For events separated in space such that no signal can travel between them, there is no absolute order. One observer says A happened first, another says B happened first. Both are correct. There is no fact of the matter. Causality survives not because time flows, but because the speed of light limits which events can influence which others. Cause and effect are constrained by geometry, not by a moving present. This distinction matters enormously. It means causality is not an arrow embedded in time. It is a pattern that emerges from space-time structure. Once you see that, the idea that the future cannot affect the past stops sounding like a law of nature and starts sounding like a habit of speech. Physics does not state that rule. It states constraints on influence. Those constraints are symmetric in time. You were taught wrong about time because you were taught with stories instead of structures. And this is where Feynman's approach becomes crucial again. He was famously allergic to explanations that replaced mystery with familiar words. He wanted mechanisms, not metaphors. When people asked him why time works the way it does, he didn't give them comfort. He gave them clarity. Clarity is uncomfortable when it contradicts what you've always assumed. The truth is that physics never found a place where time flows. It never found a cosmic engine pushing moments forward. It found relationships. It found symmetries. It found constraints. Everything else was added later to make the math feel human. Once you strip those additions away, the picture that remains is consistent and strange in a very precise way. The universe does not age. It does not wait. It does not advance. It simply contains events arranged in space-time. Your experience of aging is real. Your experience of waiting is real. Your experience of anticipation is real. But none of those experiences define the structure of time. They are phenomena inside it. This is why the sentence, "You've been taught wrong about time," is not an insult. It's a diagnosis. You were taught a version of time optimized for intuition, not accuracy. Physics has been quietly correcting that version for over a century. It corrected it when simultaneity broke. It corrected it when time dilation was measured. It corrected it when gravity bent clocks. Each correction chipped away at the old picture. What remains is not nihilism. It's precision. Time is not what you think, because thinking evolved for survival, not for understanding space-time. Understanding comes from measurement, mathematics, and a willingness to abandon comforting pictures when they fail. And they have failed. There is a moment, if you follow this far enough, when the resistance changes shape. At first it feels like disbelief, then confusion, then discomfort, and finally something quieter. A realization that the problem was never time, it was expectation. You expected time to behave in a way that made human experience central. You expected the universe to organize itself around memory, anticipation, and choice. You expected now to be a physical feature rather than a psychological one. Physics never made those promises. Once you see that, the phrase, "You've been taught wrong about time," stops sounding accusatory and starts sounding almost mundane. Of course you were taught wrong. You were taught using language designed for intuition, not structure. You were taught metaphors that work well enough at walking speed on a small planet in weak gravity. And then those metaphors were quietly mistaken for truth. They worked until they didn't. The real truth about time is not mystical, and it is not dramatic. It is almost disappointingly mechanical. Time is how we label change. It is how we order events. It is how clocks compare paths through space-time. It does not move. It does not flow. It does not carry anything with it. Nothing in the equation says it should. When physicists talk about time dilation, they are not saying time slows down like syrup. They are saying different paths through space-time have different lengths in the time dimension. That's geometry, not motion. When physicists talk about the arrow of time, they are not talking about time itself choosing a direction. They are talking about entropy and probability, about why certain processes are overwhelmingly likely in one direction and fantastically unlikely in the other. And when physicists talk about the future, they are not talking about something unreal waiting to be created. They are talking about regions of space-time you have not yet interacted with. That's it. Everything else was story. This doesn't make life meaningless. It makes it more precise. Your experiences still matter. Your choices still matter. Your deliberations still matter. They matter because they are real events with real consequences, not because they summon reality into existence. You are not standing at the edge of time, pulling the universe forward behind you. You are moving along a path through a structure that does not need your permission to exist. That realization feels cold only if you were expecting warmth from physics. Physics does not do warmth. It does accuracy. And accuracy has a strange side effect. Once you accept it, many fears dissolve. The fear that the future existing means nothing matters fades when you realize mattering never depended on indeterminacy. The fear that time being a dimension makes life mechanical fades when you realize experience is not erased by structure. The fear that losing a flowing present means losing meaning fades when you realize meaning was never a property of time itself. Meaning is something embedded systems generate locally. Like you, this is why the hardest part of understanding time is not learning new facts. It's unlearning habits of thought that felt so natural you never questioned them. You were taught that time passes. You were taught that the present is special. You were taught that the future is unreal. You were taught that physics somehow supports all of this. It doesn't. Physics supports something stranger and far more consistent. A universe where time is a coordinate, not a force. Where the present is a perspective, not a feature. Where the future exists in exactly the same way the past does, as part of a structure you are inside of, not outside of. Once you stop demanding that time behave the way it feels, you stop being confused by how it actually behaves. And that's the real lesson hidden underneath everything. Not that time is weird. Not that reality is hostile to intuition, but that intuition was never designed to describe reality at this scale in the first place. Physics is not here to make you comfortable. It is here to make you less wrong. And when it comes to time, being less wrong means accepting that nearly everything you were taught was a useful approximation, not the truth. The truth is quieter. Time doesn't flow. The universe doesn't wait. The future isn't unreal. There is just a space-time structure, and you, moving through it with limited information, experiencing slices and calling that experience now. That's not a failure of reality. That's what it means to be inside it.